As we examined the Jewish interpretation in the first part of the study of the history of biblical interpretation, we noticed a distinction between two types of interpretation. In other words, Ezra at the beginning there was interpreting the Bible, or translating it from Hebrew into the language that they had learned while they were in captivity. And in doing so, Ezra was trying to find the obvious meaning, or what's called the literal meaning. But as we looked at other Jewish scholars influenced by Greek philosophy and Greek allegory, we noticed that they began to look for hidden meanings instead of the obvious meaning. So there's a distinction being made between what's called the literal or obvious meaning of the text versus the allegorical meaning. Or, for instance, when you talk about literal or obvious meaning of the text, we talk about a grammatical and historical. So when we discuss the literal meaning or the obvious meaning, we are meaning a grammatical and historical interpretation, as opposed to allegorical. So grammatical and historical, and we'll talk a lot about this in the next coming weeks, but the grammatical and historical interpretation of Scripture is searching for the author's intended meaning. In other words, what did the author of the writing intend to say? For instance, if Moses has written Genesis there, then we're searching for Moses' intended meaning in Genesis. So we try to put the Scripture in its grammatical and historical context in order to understand what Moses intended to say. The allegorical approach, as opposed to the grammatical, historical, or obvious, or literal, the grammatical, historical approach, the allegorical approach, disregards the grammatical, historical interpretation. They disregard the literal or obvious meaning, and they're seeking for hidden meanings. Now, in this part of our study of the history of biblical interpretation, we'll start studying the early church fathers. And for the next 4 frames on the PowerPoint, we'll be looking at the early church fathers all the way through the Middle Ages. So first, when you look at the early church fathers, what we find in the first centuries of the church, we find that most of the leaders of the church were following a literal or obvious meaning of the text. For instance, Clement of Rome, 30 to 95 AD, when we read his writings, he was taking more of a literal. What's the obvious meaning of the text? Ignatius of Antioch in Pisidia, again, first century to 2nd century, he also took a literal approach. Polycarp, again, 1st and 2nd century, the Epistle of Barnabas, he takes a different approach. This is where we see Barnabas beginning to take allegory, or what's called geometria, finding numerology and secret meanings in the text. Justin Martyr of Samaria, he took a literal approach, as well as Irenaeus or Tertullian of Carthage. These all took a literal approach. So in the 1st, 2nd century, really the Epistle of Barnabas is where we see allegory creeping in, and allegory being trying to find secret meanings behind the text, in symbols and meanings behind letters and numbers and numerology and geometria. Now, see, the only problem with this approach is it's very subjective, in that we have no documentation of what the numbers mean, so you can sort of make the numbers mean what you want to. And when you see allegorical interpretation, you'll see that by and large they're making the text mean what they want it to mean. By the time we get into the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd century, we see 2 schools of interpretation materializing. Those 2 schools are the Alexandrian school and the Antiochian school. The Alexandrian school takes an allegorical approach. They are heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. And if you remember, Greek philosophy is influenced by a philosophy that says that ultimate reality or the cause of everything can't be known, the unmoved mover. So therefore, any words that we use about that cannot be true, so they seek hidden meaning behind the words. Again, Clement, 155 to 216 AD, and Origen, were both devoted to the allegorical approach. On the other hand, the Antiochian school in Antioch was devoted to the historical grammatical interpretation. They stressed the original languages. In other words, they stressed studying the Bible in its original languages. And of course, as far as the Septuagint and Latin translations, they believed in getting behind to the Hebrew and the Greek. So even in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, they're stressing the grammatical, historical, or the literal, the obvious meaning. Dorotheus, in the 240 to 312 AD, was what we think was the founder of the Antiochian school. Again, Lucian was another founder. Dorotheus more or less prepared the founding, and Lucian was the founder. Diodorus, in the 4th century there, wrote a book on what is the difference between theory and allegory, and theory being the grammatical historical approach. And so even this early, we see a early church father writing about the difference between the two. Theodore of Mopsuestia, again, wrote a book on allegory and history against Origen. In other words, he is, again, making this distinction in his book. John Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople, he wrote 600 expository homilies attempting to take the grammatical historical approach and preach from the Bible and the scriptures there. Theodore wrote various commentaries on the Old Testament and the Pauline epistles. So again, we're seeing this distinction, and this distinction is very important. Again, as we see doctrine developing, as we see the argument over Christology, we'll see that argument is coming basically from an interpretation, a different interpretations, approaches to interpretation. So as we see this develop, we're seeing that a lot of what's going on in the last 2,000 years of history is really reducible to how you view Scripture and how it's interpreted. And we see earlier on in history that these differences were materializing even in the first centuries. In the late church fathers, 4th, 5th century, we see Jerome, who was following a Antiochian school, or a more literal or obvious or grammatical historical approach to Scripture. Tertullian, he had 3 tests for interpretation: ecumenicity, in other words, how the whole church viewed it; antiquity; and the common sense, or the literal, or the grammatical, historical, or obvious meaning. So we see Tertullian is sort of stressing the literal sense, but in Tertullian we begin to see how the ecumenicity, how the tradition and church fathers begin to affect interpretation. Augustine, again in the 4th and 5th centuries, he used both the allegory and literal. He used allegory to solve problems in Scripture. And so Augustine would use both. So again, we see as the church begins to develop, we see the church beginning to move away from literal and move to allegory. And this is prominent, and we begin to see it around the 4th and 5th centuries. John Cassian believed in a fourfold meaning in Scripture. He saw the historical, the allegorical, the tropological, the moral, which is called the moral, or the anagogical, which is the secret meaning. So even Cassian there is moving somewhat, while he holds to historical. Him and Augustine both are moving somewhat away from the obvious meaning or the grammatical historical. Eucharius of Lyons, he wrote rules for allegory. So again, we see the 4th and 5th century a move away from there. Adrian of Antioch wrote an introduction to the sacred scriptures, where he stressed literalism, or the grammatical historical approach, as primary. Junilius, he wrote rules for the divine law. Faith and reason were not opposites. Interpretation of the Bible must begin with grammatical historical analysis. So again, in the 4th and 5th centuries, we still see the church fathers primarily following the grammatical, historical, and obvious meaning, but we see a move toward church authority instead of Bible authority and allegory. During the Middle Ages, we see a large stress on allegory. Greg the Great, the Venerable Bede, Alcuin, were all devoted to the allegorical scriptures. And one must ask the question as we look down this list, why is it they're moving toward allegory? And as you see, as we saw the church develop and ecclesiology develop and how the church was ruled, we saw that, we had churches in each area, but then you begin to have the idea of hierarchy, where you'd have a bishop and even a pope that's over everything. And most of us believe that Gregory the Great's the first pope. Well, if you're going to rule at the top down, they moved away from what we, even as Baptists, to have the local church. They began to have a hierarchy with a pope and to rule over a large and many churches who tend to interpret the Bible differently. In order to rule that, instead of Bible authority, the church began to move to church authority. And that's when they really begin to move toward allegory. So that's why we see Gregory the Great moving to an allegorical approach, because he's trying to rule as Pope over all the churches in the Roman Empire. And so Bede and Alcuin are allegory. Rabanus Maurus, a pupil of Alcuin, he saw the historical meaning as milk, the allegorical as bread, and then he moved on in the topological as wine. So you see, Rabanus is de-emphasizing the historical meaning of the text and just looking for a moral meaning or an allegorical meaning. Now, Rashi, in the 10th century and 11th century, he began to emphasize the grammatical. So for a period of about 400 or 500 years, the church stressed allegory where they could rule. But Rashi began to emphasize grammar and syntax and the grammatical, historical, and literal approach. The Victorines, Hugo, Andrew, and Richard, in the 11th century and 12th century, were focusing on the literal sense. So we see that by the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries, we see the literal approach coming back. What does the scripture say instead of the authority of the church? So these Victorines, those were beginning to move. Now, Bernard of Clairvaux, he's heavily mystic. Joachim of Flora, he used both approaches. Stephen of Langdon was allegory. Thomas Aquinas did stress the literal meaning of Scripture, but also believed there was a spiritual meaning behind it. Nicholas of Lyra influenced Luther. He went back to the Hebrew, the literal grammatical approach to Scripture. And of course, John Wycliffe. Everybody knows who he was. He was a precursor of the Reformation, and he stressed the grammatical, historical interpretation of Scripture as opposed to authority of the Catholic Church. He's called the morning star of the Reformation. So Wycliffe is challenging the authority of the church as it grew there in the early part of the church and in the Middle Ages. And so Wycliffe is who we see as the precursor of the Reformation.